Frederick Douglass had a profound impact upon our nation that when we become, and we will, the 51st state, D.C. will then mean Douglass Commonwealth.
America is the one place on earth, he argues, that all peoples, all ethnicities, all nationalities, all cultures, all religions are coming to. I mean, you first read it and you think, whoa.
He's sitting here crying about her. I just want to cry. But, you know, like, we never have... this is like the only record we have of him crying. He's that moved to emotion.
He used technology strategically, smartly. He did then what we do with social media today.
Making slavery forever impossible in the United States. Though we waited long, we saw all of this and more.
From slavery to the women who were so paramount in his life, persuaded a president and its people, we owe so much to Frederick Douglass.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm really, really grateful for your being here for this wonderful program in our Defining Fathers series, this time talking about the man, Frederick Douglass. It's such a real treat to be here, Cedar Hill at his home, and to welcome all of you. I'm Michael Steele. I am the former Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Maryland, former chairman of the Republican National Committee, and currently the host of The Weekend on MSNBC, which is a lot of fun. But I'm really, really glad to be here and to be partnered once again with my good friend, Mayor Sharron Pratt. She is, talk about a lightning in a bottle. She's something else. Just amazing how she's been able to pull all of this together and to have such an incredible team over at the University of the District of Columbia working with her in this program to stand up a conversation about this great city, my home, Washington, D.C., and it's really, really exciting to have you all here. I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel that's going to be a part of our conversation today. And to welcome them as well. Dr. Lee Faught, Associate Professor of History, Lemoyne University, author of Women in the World of Frederick Douglass. She has explored how race and gender dynamics have intersected throughout history and our present. Professor Faught has said that as a little white girl growing up in the South, the odd mix of patriotism, race, women's history, and living history profoundly affected her. She discovered that there were many different pasts, and their stories frequently conflicted, yet complemented one another. This drew her to become a historian and to understand why there in America are selective pasts, not one past representing all truths. Also like to welcome Dr. David Blight, the Sterling Professor of History, African American Studies, and American Studies at Yale University. He is the director of Yale's Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Professor Blight is well known as the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. His work not only deepens our understanding of history, but challenges us to consider how the past shapes our present. And of course, the one and only, the formidable former Mayor Sharron Pratt and founder of the Institute for Politics, Policy, and History. I am really excited, Madam Mayor, to introduce you and to turn the floor over to you for your welcoming comments and getting us started.
Thank you, Michael. I would stand, but they've got the microphone attached to my purse. And any woman in the audience understands that I can't move. But first off, I do want to thank everyone for being here. And to thank this extraordinary team of scholars who are with us today. I especially wish to thank Michael Steele. Michael has been, for all that you do, not just for the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, but also what you're doing for our country, trying to provide us with some clarity of thought.
Thank you.
And we are very blessed that we have the co-chair. Michael is the co-chair of our advisory committee, and with us is Karen Tramontano. And I want to as well acknowledge Carol Fulp, who does an extraordinary job of choreographing these kinds of events, and Carol is also on our advisory committee. And I don't know if we have any members of the Board of Trustees with us. Are you telling me something, Ro? And we also want to thank them. And of course, W.K. Kellogg Foundation has been with us from the beginning. They provided us with the seed money that made it possible for us to advance this program, first of defining fathers, and now, founding fathers and then defining fathers. I'm so nervous about ever skipping anything that Carol told me to do, and that's the reason I keep looking at my notes. Let me explain quickly, because we want to get to the essence of it. The Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, launched by Mayor Bowser and the president of the University of the District of Columbia, has an overriding mission to rediscover the history of Washington, D.C., the capital of this country. Amazing, very limited scholarship about it. We have Fergus Bordewick with us, but very limited scholarship about it. And that is our mission. And so we began last year with trying to identify how it is that the capital ended up here in the Chesapeake region, because the vote originally was overwhelmingly for it to remain where it had been throughout the Revolutionary War in Pennsylvania. But they didn't want it in Pennsylvania. They said, no, this is an abolitionist-leaning state, and they wanted it in the Chesapeake region, which at that time had 1/2 of all enslaved people in America. Now, they were wonderfully visionary men, Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, but that was a major stumbling block. These three defining fathers are the ones who helped catapult what was a backwater venue into a major metropolis, and not surprisingly, the book ends around slavery. It was the ending of slavery. Abraham Lincoln by prosecuting the Civil War, Frederick Douglass for making emancipation a central theme of that Civil War, and therefore many people wanting to come into this region. And finally, Ulysses Grant, not because so much he was the general, but he was the one who made Reconstruction a reality, a tremendous impact, where you have things like the Freedmen's Bureau. My sister and I were born in a hospital still called Freedmen's. So, it had quite an impact. So this is what we're here today to talk about, Frederick Douglass. And finally, let me say this. Frederick Douglass had a profound impact upon our nation, but he had such an impact upon this community that when we become, and we will, the 51st state, D.C. will then mean Douglass Commonwealth. So with that, I turn it over to someone who knows what he's doing, Michael Steele.
Well, I still have to prove that. So it's, again, thank you so much, Mayor, for the opportunity. And so let's just get right into the conversation, because we're sitting here on the porch of Frederick Douglass's storied Cedar Hill home, and you're looking out on this once backwater, and you see the history and how much of a crossroads this area has become. And so I want to start with you, Dr. Blight, in sort of getting a bead in on the man himself, and sort of understanding from your work, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, what motivated him? What moved him? What were the things that pushed him, that drove him, created in him that boundless determination to learn, to stretch, to conquer, particularly given how his story began?
Well, thank you, Mayor Pratt and Michael and all the great folks who planned this. Thank you all for coming. Let me first say this is a sacred place for me, and I know for Lee. Anyone who's ever studied Douglass has to study this place. I've done research in here. The former head curator here used to let me come after hours, put on white gloves and wander the house, always under scrutiny. I was never alone. I have to tell a quick story, too, about this porch. If you've read way to the end of my book, you know this story, but Douglass at one point put rubber rings in the roof of this porch that he could hang on and do pull-ups. Now, it may not be the primary image you have of Frederick Douglass hanging from rings here, but he did it. And his grandchildren loved it because he would kick at them here on the porch. So that may break the image you came here with, this very formal house and the great formal Frederick Douglass. But imagine him in his 60s hanging here. Anyway, the drive in Douglass, first of all, begins, of course, with slavery. But I would also, he has that to overcome. But let's also remember he had no formal education. Literacy to Douglass was the very meaning of his life. Douglass became a master of language and words. He wrote millions of words, 1,200 pages of autobiography. Literacy was for Douglass something he was constantly cultivating, driving for, recreating. He also was very sensitive about the fact that he's a former slave from across the Chesapeake. No formal education. He was very sensitive to slights, all kinds of slights, racist slights, but also the slights about he's the guy with no education. And any of us who've known people with virtually none or very little education, but who become prominent at something, like art or whatever they do, they tend to be sponges. They tend to learn from people. If Frederick Douglass met you, he would quickly figure out what he can learn from you. What do you got? Teach me something. What should I read on this? What should I read on that? And when he thought he might have learned what he can learn from you, he might discard you. He wasn't that good at friendship. He might discard you and go on to the next person he can learn from. That drove him because they were always going to find him out. He's a slave from the other side of Chesapeake. Then there's, look, in my book I make a very big deal about how motivated he was by the Hebrew prophets. That his use of language throughout his life is so steeped in the King James Bible. Whether it was always faith or not is one question, but it's not the important question. The important question is that's where he learned language. And he had tremendous admiration for the greatest of the Hebrew prophets, like Jeremiah and Isaiah. It's Jeremiah who says, or I guess God is having him say, that he has fire in his bones. Jeremiah didn't want to be a prophet, but somehow he had to be. In fact, most real prophets get to be prophets that way. And so Douglass had fire in his bones that he drew from these stories and the spirit and the agony of the Old Testament. But also, at least one last thing here. What drives this man? Telling his own story. In some ways, as a biographer, you learn quickly, as Lee knows, never trust anybody who writes 3 autobiographies. Because they're trying to impose something on you, and he was. His autobiographies are always there in the way. They're always there. There are 1,200 pages of them. They're always, and the third one was written here. Probably a lot of it back in the growlery, that stone thing he built in the backyard here. But this is someone who could never stop telling his story, and the story was never static. It was always changing. He was always becoming the next thing, always becoming something else. He never stood still at whatever he had become. He got a little staid at some of his ideas later in his life, don't we all? But this is a man who was always in motion. There was always the next thing that, well, maybe I can do that. Maybe I can speak there. Maybe I can write that. Maybe I need to have something to say on that. That's a deep source of motivation when you've chosen to make your life a life of activism. If you make your life activism, you can't sit still, because history will either crush you or pass you by. It's easy to just say he's driven by the spirit of freedom and so on. Well, of course he was, but it's much deeper than that. It's the deep motivations in this man that I'm not sure any of us have ever completely been able to explain.
It's fascinating when you stop and think about the things that drove him, as you touched on, and one of those aspects of his life that I thought was also very fascinating, important, Dr. Fott, are the women in his life. You write about women in the world of Frederick Douglass, providing some of that insight into who these women were in his life. Talk a little bit about that. How did women influence his life, and how did he ultimately wind up influencing the women's movement, such as it was starting to grow here in the U.S.?
Okay. Well, first of all, I cannot begin to tell you how honored I am to be here on this stage with these impressive people. And it's not a stage, it's Douglass's porch, which when I taught here at Montgomery College, I would have students, I'd send them up here to visit, because many of them, although they lived here, had never been here. And one student told me she was sitting up here waiting to go on the tour, and she was just sitting here on the phone, and suddenly it struck her. Wait a minute, I'm on Frederick Douglass's porch. I'll call you back. And she just had to have a moment. And yeah. But to answer your question, more than really any other figure of his time, and probably since, Frederick Douglass was a man who was made by women. Not just the women who raised him, but they were the ones who helped free him intellectually, whether it was teaching him literacy or bringing him along in his literacy, bringing him new intellectual worlds, whether it was helping him become free, like running away, or become legally free when he was about to be returned to slavery because the law said he was still a slave, even though he had emancipated himself. They gave him the materials to become intellectually independent in the abolitionist movement, to become financially independent, to raise his family, to fight against racism across many different categories, whether it be a family man and raising his family and his children up to have lives and educations, or to fight just being able to sit next to a white woman, or marry a white woman, which was unheard of. It was one of the strictest taboos at the time. They preserved his memory so that they preserved this house, whether it was his second wife, Helen, or the women of the Frederick Douglass Historical and Memorial Association, Mary Talbert, the women of the Black Women's Club movement, then the National Park Service. The papers that we can study his work with. These were things that were not happening at the time that he died. And there's a reason we're able to do that, and that was because of women. So women really, and I think a lot of that had to do with, there's this concept of separate spheres. And we usually think of that as the women in the home, the men out in public. But really it's because they weren't in competition with him. They were helping him. And he could turn to them as helpers. And so they could work as partners. And so really, there are so many women along the way who keep him going. And when you look at the history of the abolitionist movement, that was what women did. They did it in the black church, and they did it in the abolitionist movement, because abolition wasn't just making speeches and writing editorials and such, you had to fundraise and you had to keep it going between events, big flashy events. And it was the women who did it. They had fairs and they sold potholders and aprons and all sorts of things, and they kept that going right into the Civil War for Freedmen's Aid. So these were the things that helped his movement and him keep going. And then as far as the women's rights movement, well, he was always their ally, and in the truest sense of an ally. He was there at Seneca Falls. He was, as far as we know, one of the only black men at Seneca Falls, and he was one of the only men to sign, and the only black men to sign their Declaration of Rights of Women. He brought women's rights into the Black Convention movement, which was like a black civil rights movement going on in the North at the time, and they were usually explicitly male, because there was, well, I won't go off on that tangent, but there was an issue there. And so he would say, we need to include women's rights here, explicitly include women's rights. We need to let women speak here. He would go to women's rights meetings, but he would endorse women's rights, but he wouldn't take over. And he would challenge the white women, because this is really where it became a problem. The white women always marginalized the black women, but he would challenge the white women on race. He would say, you need to pay attention to race. And that, well, we'll talk a little later about the 15th Amendment, but that's really where it became a big issue when the 15th Amendment was passed. And so really, you can't study Frederick Douglass without paying attention to the women. So.
Well, if I could follow up on that. If you could sort of give us your sense of these parallel movements. Mm-hmm. I mean, even in the 20th century, there was a parallel movement of the feminist movement, along with post-65 Voting Rights Act in the black community. It was always a parallel. And in fact, Jerry Ferraro ended up on the ticket in large measure because of Jesse Jackson's candidacy that sort of shook up the Democratic Party. When Douglass reached out in Seneca Falls, you feel, I gather, that it was an authentic commitment of women's rights as against a level of mutual expediency?
Well, it's a little of both, because they're all fellow travelers. But what I started to think about is there are two movements. Even though they always there's always factions within these movements that try to make them parallel movements. If you think of it more like Venn diagrams, there's an overlap. So there's the women's rights movement, and it has an overlap with the abolition movement. And then there's a Black Convention movement, that civil rights movement that has an overlap with those two. So they each have, membership in all of these movements. And so you have white women in the women's rights movement, especially as it gets towards just focusing on suffrage, because that was a later development. They were looking at a whole broad range of things. That came out of the abolitionist movement. And then you have the abolitionist movement, and depending on which abolitionist group you're looking at, some of them were pretty kind of racist. And then you have the Black Convention movement, and some of them weren't really cool about the women's rights bit. So with Douglass, where all three of those overlap, that was him. So that put him on the edge. So he was trying to promote all three and bring all three together. As the civil rights, as the sectional crisis and the Civil War started to come into play, that became much more, I always joke about it as butch, but it became much more masculine, because that was the fight that came to the front. Right. And so when it becomes a war, that's a very male sort of a struggle. And then it comes to citizenship, and then it comes to voting. All of these things, the claim for citizenship and the claim for voting is based on having fought in a war. So this is all making it a very masculine sort of an argument. And so that kind of leaves women to the side. But when you're starting to look at, if you're going to look at it through the women's rights movement, those aren't just white women. There are black women in there too. And they're in there in all of this Venn diagram as well. And so that puts them in a really peculiar position in relation to how these movements are reconfiguring themselves. He's not his bad guy.
So I know that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed man, was he not, of the 19th century?
Probably.
Why so? How so?
Well, Douglass was probably, I mean, you'll get an argument on this from the Grant people and maybe even from George Armstrong Custer people. But Douglass probably was the most photographed American of that century, in the century that gave us photography. First of all, he loved modernity. He loved new technology. Like a lot of Americans, he was fascinated with the printing press and made his life with it. He was fascinated with the telegraph. He got overwhelmingly fascinated with photography. He wrote 3 essays about it. During the Civil War, in fact, he took time out to write a very philosophical essay about photography in 1862 or 63. And then, of course, don't forget good looks. I mean, the man was stunning, let's be honest. But also, I think more important, 2 other things. He traveled constantly. Constantly. In my book, I can't prove this, and there's no way, but I think he was probably he traveled more miles probably than any other American of the 19th century as a lecturer, although probably not more than Mark Twain. But Mark Twain lived into the early 20th century, so the numbers get skewed. But Douglass went everywhere. Spoke in every church, every town hall, every park you could imagine across what we call the Middle West, all over the North, and eventually even in the South. And everywhere he went, the local photographer wanted him to sit for a photograph. He developed favorite photographers. A guy named Hurd, who he went to, I don't know, 12 times or more because he liked his work. And if Douglass did a photograph and didn't quite like the initial result, he might do it over. I mean, no, do this profile, you know. And last but not least, this man, and you can tell by looking at these photos, this man used these photographs to portray himself. Look at me. I'm a black man. I am really well dressed, and I'm really intelligent. Check it out. I'm not what you may expect of average black men. And it was his way of, oh, and especially after he was on the cover of Harper's, which is the equivalent today of being the lead logo on Google, you know, or whatever, you know, Time magazine. In fact, visually, he became almost universally recognizable, which in the 19th century was something, to say the least. And it became a problem for him. Fame became a serious problem for Douglass. That's another whole story. But we're now we're up to about 170, I think, extant photographs of Douglass. Is it even more?
I don't know.
Oh, because everyone's always finding a new one somewhere. But it's, yeah. Anyway, and those photographs are themselves a kind of history of his life. And they begin very early, and they go all the way to late 1894, when we get the last photograph of the aging, which is one of my favorites. The old lion in that photograph just is haunting. So he used this medium to kind of portray an image that the country had never seen.
Can I add into that?
Please.
I think it's also important to remember what he's, first of all, you know, the first time people have seen like human-like images as opposed to paintings or drawings. And the human-like image and the images that he's portraying, if you go to the, because I just went for the first time, the African American History Museum, and they have images in this one section that are these very racist images. And if people are getting the images they're consuming, and that they're being, and I'm talking about white people who are getting these images that they're consuming that are very racist, that are stereotypes. And this is what is affecting the way they're thinking about race and African Americans. And then they get this picture of Douglass dignified, beautiful, intelligent. That is an incredibly powerful argument against those cartoons. And so if this is what's the popular image, and then he comes out and he argues against that with his image. And if you think about, even in the science books, those profile images, you've seen them, the Giddens profile, that, you know, they've got the monkey and then the Roman and then the African. And we can laugh at them because they're so just ridiculous, you know, that people would believe that. But that's in the science books. And then he goes, no, this is a real person. This is an argument. And I think that's what's the most, you know, the clickbait is the most photographed man in American history. The real point is that was the argument he was making.
And I love some of the photos where he's out on the road somewhere. It's taken in Hillsdale, Michigan, or one of my favorite photos was taken in Hillsdale, Michigan. But you can tell he's been on the road a while because those pants are looking pretty run down, and, you know, he's not, it doesn't look perfect. I love those too. And sometimes the face is just tired. Oh, and you can tell. What city is this? What day is this?
Well, it's that human aspect of it that, you know, particularly during this period, you lose sight of, because African American men especially were caricatured. They were stereotyped, and there were images of them, you know, that aligned them with apes. And so this idea of this well-dressed, beautiful black man, you know, who's being photographed, and there are countless photographs of him, really must have shaken the perception that mainstream white America, particularly in our major cities like Philadelphia, here in Washington, D.C., and certainly throughout the South, having to reconcile this imagery of Frederick Douglass sort of emerging along with this new technology at the same time. One other aspect of this I want to go back to, Dr. Fott, that you raised in talking about Douglass and his role with women was there's still some discord between Douglass and women, as much as women informed and leveled him up in many ways. He was not necessarily a big fan of the 15th Amendment, and that created some conflict and some controversy between him and the women who had supported him when it came to the very thing they needed him to support on their behalf. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay, yeah. What the conventional story is that, okay, the 15th Amendment came down, it gave black men the right to vote. Douglass supported it rather than opposing it because there was this movement for universal suffrage. Yes and no. What it is first of all to remember that Douglass didn't write the amendment. Okay. And when you're an activist, quite often you've got to make a choice between accepting the laws that are made and that are being proposed because that's the best you're going to get, or opposing them. And it's important to remember two things about the 15th Amendment. One, this was the most radical Congress on the issue of suffrage that the country had seen at this point. Okay, the most radicals, and the best they could do was to word it not black men can vote, period, but that you can't deny a person the right to vote based on race, color, prior condition of servitude, which left the door open to deny people the right to vote on whatever, which opened the door to Jim Crow, which then left a century of fighting against that, which meant we had to have a civil rights movement, and we're still having to fight against these sorts of things today, voter suppression. So this was the best thing they were ever going to get out of this Congress. So you have to make the choice. There was this movement of abolitionists and women's rights, and they had all supported abolition, and they all wanted universal suffrage, that everybody could vote. This was a right. And this was the best they were getting out of this Congress, which showed that there were men in Congress who were far more sexist than they were racist, mostly because they wanted those votes in the South. So you now have these activists saying, okay, do we take the best thing we're ever going to get and run with it, or do we go, no, it's not perfect, so we're going to oppose it and never get anything? And in the black, if you read what the black women like Sojourner Truth, and this is at the very end of her life, or Frances Ellen Watkins Harper are saying on this, they're like, oh, this is ugly, because where do we fall in this? It's, you see what the dilemma is for them. But ultimately, you know, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a lot of the white women suffragists, they're like, we're not losing anything, so we're going to oppose it. And Douglass is saying, no, we got to accept it, because the black women may not be getting the vote either, but the black community is getting the vote. And in the South, and this means also in the North, because there's still voter restrictions in northern states. Douglass's sons couldn't vote when they went to fight at Fort Wagner in the Massachusetts 55th, because there were property qualifications in New York. So this is a big deal. And there are people being, you know, their status as voters in the South. They had been enslaved, and their status as voters in the South is in question. So now they're going to be able to vote, and the Constitution says they are, at least for a while. And so that's important. And so that puts at least black women a little bit closer, and definitely gives black men, or definitely for a while, gives black men the right to vote. And that gives the community that electoral protection. And so that's the wedge in. And I think the white women who abandoned that purpose also abandoned their abolitionist roots. They abandoned that part of their mission. And they hooked up with some really nasty people in Kansas, and George Train, for instance. And so it wasn't Douglass who abandoned the women, it was the women, those women who abandoned Douglass, because it was just like, well, we got this victory, now we move on to fighting the next fight, which is women's suffrage, which he did keep fighting for. And now, and as he told them, the white woman suffrage, look, white women have different ways, many ways, of attaching themselves to power. They knew it. But black women did not, because their community had no electoral power. But now the community has electoral power. And when you start going down and reading about black Reconstruction in the South, you see it. They're protecting the guns outside of the political meetings. You know, they're going with their husbands to the voting booth, and they're saying, "Vote. This is how we're voting. Go in there." And women up to suffrage had not been central to the women's rights movement for a while, until it became central in this area, because there was a whole bunch of other things that they had as part of their agenda. There's a much broader agenda earlier than the Civil War. So, yeah, I mean,
it's a milestone.
yeah. So,
I mean, it's the first time since the inception of the country that the notion of we the people has been amended.
yeah.
We the people was initially white men, particularly white men with property.
Yeah,
so this is the very first time they start expanding the notion of who the heck is we the people.
Yeah, and at the federal level.
Right.
Yeah.
So that brings us to another question for Dr. Blight. Especially as we're on the eve of a historic election, potentially. Let's hope.
I heard there was one.
Yeah, one too.
So, when contributing to the anthology, Our American Story, you cite Frederick Douglass's 1867 Composite Nation speech, where he's calling for a multi-ethnic, multi-racial nation, really particularly thinking that United States, America, will be the one that will advance these concepts in our civilization. And if we don't get there, at least we must try. How do you think we're doing? Are we going to get there? And do you think we're trying?
Oh, we're trying, but we're not doing very well, let's be honest. We're a mess. I'll come back to the mess. First of all, this speech, it's not the most widely known of Douglass's speeches. There are others that are more famous. He first writes it in 1867, and he starts delivering it in 68, 69. It is, in some ways, if not the most, is one of the most hopeful speeches of his life. It's this key moment that Lee pointed to of the peak success of Reconstruction, the Reconstruction Acts, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. When he first gives this speech, the 15th Amendment is being debated and soon to happen in 69, 70. He now represents in this speech what he believes is the reinvented United States, the Second Republic, the Second Founding. He believes this new Constitution based in these three amendments and the first Civil Rights Law and several others is a new America. It's a new republic. And he fashions this speech that if you read it, you can pull it up online, it's easy to find. Composite Nation. It reads like a multiculturalism manifesto from the 1990s. It reads like a mission statement of universities today. America is the one place on earth, he argues, that all peoples, all ethnicities, all nationalities, all cultures, all religions are coming to and can come to, and all can live under one flag, one constitution. I mean, you first read it and you think, whoa, what happened to the pre-war radical Douglass? Well, he's become a radical patriot of the new Constitution, the Second Republic. And he really believes what he's saying. I found no evidence of him ever giving this speech again after about 1872, as Reconstruction begins to erode, fade, be defeated by violence and otherwise across the South. He doesn't give the Composite Nation speech. Yeah, I mean, he speaks about the ideas of it, but he never gives that speech again after the waning of Reconstruction. But at the heart of the speech, this is the big surprise in it. After laying out what a democracy is, and he has a beautiful definition of that, laying out even what a nation, he says, is that entity to which we give our loyalty, but we must give something up. A democratic nation. And we've spent the last 8 years defining democracy over and over and over. But at the middle of the speech, suddenly he breaks and he starts talking about Chinese immigration. And Chinese immigration was just then becoming a pretty big national issue. The first Chinese Exclusion Act will come in 1874. There's a large Chinese immigration coming into the West. He makes this beautiful case. He says, in effect, America, get ready. They're coming. Yes, they have an alien religion. Yes, they have an alien language. You don't know their language. They don't know yours. But he uses the model of the melting pot. They will come here. They will be taken over by our values, our traditions, our rights, our liberties, our creeds. They came here to buy into our creeds. And so typical of Douglass, he uses nature as metaphors. They're coming over the rivers. They're coming over the mountains. And he says, America, get ready. We're becoming something the world has never seen. This multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural people under a constitution. And it ends with this beautiful, moving tribute to the natural rights tradition, which was the core of his thought. It's an amazing speech, especially in the context when he gives it. And then when we realize how Reconstruction all but kind of crushed this dream, at least momentarily. And one other quick thing. In this moment of Douglass's tremendous hope of the late 60s, early 70s, he even became a kind of a soft imperialist. He thought America should now start exporting this new liberty, this new republic. We should start exporting the 14th Amendment to the Caribbean, to South America, wherever anybody wanted it. If people were enslaved or exploited and discriminated against, let's take our 14th Amendment to them. And it's written in the language of a kind of imperialism. So he's complicated. But at that point, he's the radical patriot envisioning this America we're still trying to create. And maybe one last quick thing. We're in trouble also, Mayor, not because of our ideas, but we're in trouble because of our structures. There's a lot about this Constitution that is not working.
Absolutely.
I'll just say that and let you think about it.
A little cliffhanger there. No, I'd love what exactly. I love what you said about Douglass making the point. They're coming. They're coming. Wake up, America. Well, guess what? They're here. We're all here, and it really, Dr. Falt, brings us to the moment we find ourselves in right now, where we're on the precipice of electing the first woman president of the United States, the first black woman president of the United States. And I was giving some thought to this when I was on set recently. Actually, it was debate night, watching that excitement unfold the way it did. And I was saying, in 2 years' time, thinking to myself, we will be celebrating 250 years of this nation's birth, formation, existence. And can you imagine having a black female president leading that nation at that time, 250 years later? It is something that is both exciting and daunting. And it is daunting because of something you said, because you made note of the fact that white women at that time had a different agenda. Mm-hmm. And that agenda was very much aligned with who? Their husbands. Mm-hmm. The white men in their lives who owned the property and the land and moved the nation. I would posit that is still somewhat true today. And that as I look at this election, I keep telling my Democratic friends, the weakest link in your armor are white suburban women.
Yeah.
Because they will vote their particular interests that may, on the surface, you would think, well, that's not the bigger interest you should have. But it is the interest of those closest to them, whether it's their family, their spouses, their boyfriends, whatever. Provide us some context and perspective on that aspect of what was happening at that time around issues like the 15th Amendment, which was a point of contention among women and Douglass, and how that kind of looks at how we should be looking at that today as a particular potential point of contention in this election between a Kamala Harris and that voting bloc that she's going to need.
That wasn't on the list.
Sorry, a little extemporaneous moment here because you brought it out here. You got me thinking about it in terms of the arc of history, how we find these parallels.
No, I'm
that
glad.
are existing.
Well, that is the thing. Is we have these white women. I mean, Susan B. Anthony was single all her life, and Elizabeth E. Cady Stanton was married and had several children, and. But yeah, they were still thinking of themselves as white women, and they saw, like, if they were interested in abolition, it was more out of a sense of, I mean, I never saw them, they were more fellow travelers as abolition, as opposed to real dyed-in-the-wool abolitionists, as a lot of the other women in Douglass's life were. And and they had, they had real interest. I mean, women did need rights and the ability to vote, because a lot of, if you look at, say, the Seneca Falls Declaration of Women's Rights, and you look at all of the list of what they talk about at subsequent things, they needed things like the ability to sit on juries, they needed to be able to own their own property and other things like that. But when Douglass told them you have the ability to attach yourself to power, women do have today the ability to separate themselves from their husbands like that. We do have the ability, a lot of it happened within my own lifetime, the ability to get your own credit, own your own house, own your own car, have right over your own wages and your own children, those sorts of things. So there has been progress made. So I'm still trying to figure out why a lot of white women still go conservative and vote against their interest in things like reproductive control. That is your body you want control over. And so I really have no answer to it. So I'm like...
I think because for me, it's around this idea, when you're looking at the arc of slavery,
yeah.
And it's around this idea that women have been treated as second-class citizens,
yeah.
throughout this timeline,
yeah.
And yet when you have a moment where you can sort of break that stranglehold on your citizenship, there seems to be this tension that sort of keeps them bound to it in some way. And I'm just curious as to how that gets reconciled at that time, and how as a nation do we, going forward, continue to try to reconcile that particular tension.
Well, I think at that time, they were so bound to whatever power was in their life. There were, that's why they kind of focused on getting the vote so you could have the power to make the laws that would change all of these other ways that the laws did tie you to a man. Coverture, I guess, would be the broadest way to put it.
Well, also, you're so right. Women didn't have any economic rights in the 19th century. In fact, Douglass supported the New York State Women's Economic Rights Bill, which would have given them right to their own property, right to, after divorce, the right to their children, and on and on. And on. He supported that. It did not pass.
So, and now I think sometimes that, the class alignment of women is usually with their husbands, and there still is an inequality. Like when women get married and have children, their economic status goes down. That when they get divorced, their economic status goes down. That even in the workplace, that they are perceived as, they still get paid less. So there is still this inequality across the board. Certainly it's a lot better than it was 200 years ago, but there's still, and then if you are, and that's just white women. You put any other kind of marginalized identity in there, and it goes even lower. And so, having to address all of these within the law, maybe that's why it's usually suburban white women who are the ones who are less likely to vote in their own interest, because they see their interest as their own and fine. Whereas it takes going beyond your own interest to see your interest is tied with other people's, and other people's is tied with yours. And not sure if I'm making myself clear. I'm kind of thinking out loud.
No, I was not. I think you covered it well, and it really speaks to the complexity of the relationships that inform and do continue to form within the culture itself, and certainly politically, and how interest groups, whether it's women writ large, white women specifically, women of color, continue to fight those battle lines. And sometimes they aligned as allies, and other times they found themselves a little bit more at odds because there were other interests that they were taking into consideration, particularly as a white woman, that a black woman, for example, could not, because she didn't have access to the same level of economic and other types of support. You know, for Dr. Blight, for me, in a particular way, Frederick Douglass is like coming home because of the role that he played in the beginnings of the Republican Party. And a lot of Republicans like to throw his picture up and say a lot of things. I'm like, brother, you don't even know half the story. Come on now, let's be honest about where you.
Telling them that.
Yeah, right. Where you're going here. You know, I've always defined myself as a Lincoln Republican, and I've always been intrigued by the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, and what that looked like, and how that would play itself out, how he really influenced Lincoln in many ways, and the impact that Lincoln had on him. But there were also some other Republicans that had some interesting stories that claimed Frederick Douglass as well. Talk a little bit about all of that.
Well, I was looking forward to this. And to be brief, Douglass is a very complicated 19th century Republican. No question, he was a Republican. The Republican Party was the ship, all else was the sea, as he famously said. He didn't have much other choice. What has happened with the reputation, as you say, well, first of all, let's admit, Americans now across the spectrum appropriate Douglass. He's become a little bit like Lincoln in that sense, like Ben Franklin in that sense. Everybody has their Ben Franklin they want to pluck out. Everybody has their Jefferson too, and their Lincoln and their Douglass. Conservative, limited government Republicans in the modern era for a long time now have been appropriating a particular quotation from Douglass out of a couple particular speeches, where he said during Reconstruction, everyone is asking, what should be done with the Negro? And my answer, he says, is do nothing with them. Leave them alone. Let them have, but often, some of your less informed Republican friends have always stopped right there, and they don't go on any further. Because then Douglass goes into a whole riff about, he says, but give them fair play before the law. That has been taken from Douglass. And of course, Frederick Douglass believed vehemently in this idea of self-reliance. No question. How could you be a black leader in the 19th century and not believe in self-reliance? Because if you're not, they would enslave you. They would exploit you. They might kill you during Reconstruction. You needed some self-reliance when the law doesn't protect. He was always, and he preached it to his sons. Oh my God, they got tired of hearing it. He preached this to his sons, get property, own something. And they had to struggle in life of keeping jobs and so forth. But some people have appropriated this part of Douglass and dragged him way through history to make him a proponent of limited government. The truth is, Douglass believed in self-reliance, but he believed even more vehemently in activist, interventionist government to free slaves, defeat the Confederacy, reinvent the U.S. Constitution, and enforce the rights that Reconstruction brought about. He believed only the federal government could, at the end of the day, actually do that. And I think history proved him right on that one. It doesn't mean that he's not back there at the place of origin in this Republican Party that was the political movement that brought us finally an anti-slavery politics that became an emancipation politics in the midst of war and became the political persuasion that reinvented this country. And he goes to every national Republican convention from 1864 the rest of his life. He wasn't always happy with the candidates. He often would prefer this one to that one. He liked Garfield. He didn't like Blaine, and so on and so forth through the latter 19th century. But he's always at Republican conventions, and he's always invited to speak. There wasn't a national convention of the Republicans at which Douglass did not speak. And he took a lot of heat for that from other black leaders. Which, by the way, is another one of your motivations. What drove Douglass? His rivals.
Yeah.
Aren't we sometimes driven by our rivals? Somebody's trying to knock you off your pedestal. He liked being on his pedestal. That motivated him.
You know, I have a question, or had a question, that sort of, you know, built on this sort of tensions with the women's movement and civil rights movement, but we sort of explored that sort of deeply, you know. And maybe in some ways, if I can just offer a commentary, we ought not to be surprised that ultimately, if indeed she is the first woman president, that she is someone that had to draw upon both of those movements and discover a sense of agency. So in some ways, we ought not to be surprised that it's a woman who's also marginalized because of ethnicity that may pull this off, as I hope she will.
Well,
But
can I also
yeah,
add,
please.
that usually when we're looking at history of firsts, the first black is always male, and we've had that with Obama.
Right.
And the first woman is always white. But this could be a time, this could be a time where the first woman
Yeah.
is of color.
Right.
And that, wow.
And I just think that there is a sense of agency there.
Yeah.
You know, where you just said, okay, this system doesn't work for me. I clearly, if I'm going to make it, I got to define myself, as did Frederick Douglass. I mean, you know, there was no way he was going to be accepted in that system. If you're confused about whether you'll be accepted, but if you know you're not going to be accepted, but that is not historical commentary, huh?
He learned how to be hated and then used it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You have to admire people who have that kind of agency. He did, and in many ways, to me, Abraham Lincoln is a man who had a great sense of self in spite of. But let me ask you this. I think this is the last question, I think. Frederick Douglass always had insight about if you have a victory, there is a price to pay. You know what I mean? You know, Reconstruction, but there will be a price to pay. Can you offer any insights, either of you, but Dr. Blight first, regarding that a continuing notion?
Yeah, 1,000 times over, Douglass tells us, whether it's during the abolition movement with all of its defeats and sometimes modest successes, or whether it's during the war and its horrific bloodletting, which he fully supported, and then with Reconstruction and its aftermath and its defeat, he's always warning, be careful with your victories, because history is still coming to get you. Douglass had this long view of history. It's biblical in many ways, that history's never over. It can't be over. You may think it's going someplace, and we're just not quite there yet. And he could sound like that at times, but he always knew history wasn't over. And I mean, during Reconstruction, he's constantly using, and he has explicit speeches on it, that, you know, our cause is not over. In fact, especially after the passage of the 15th Amendment, especially after Republicans started saying, our job is done. We created the right to vote. Douglass's answer to that was to say, yeah. The vote, he said, is the ring of fire, his language, around all of our other rights. But what about the rest of them? And he kept warning the country that the South was defeated on the battlefield, but it was not defeated in their minds. That former slaveholders were still there. And pretty soon, of course, they're back in power. He had this wonderful long view of history, that it's never over. And it's one of the ways he could sustain himself by the 1880s and 1890s, when times are really difficult, especially into the age of lynching, which was the last great subject of his life and the last great speech of his life. Yeah, you need to remember, too, Douglass lives from 1818 to 1895. It's most of the 19th century. He was born before steamboats were going around on rivers. He's born before the telegraph, before the railroad, before the printing press, before the phonograph, before all these technological photography. all these advances that began to create this modern world. Transatlantic cable was laid in his lifetime. He marveled at that. He could send a telegram now to London, for God's sake. So he saw this arc of history, and then he saw the arc of America's racial history and political history, and the pivot of his life, he's in his 40s, was, of course, the Civil War and emancipation. But then he's going to live long enough to see that being, in effect, eroded and all but washed away. He could have ended up in utter despair, but he wasn't. Sometimes he was. He died, by the way, right inside that door. But that's another story.
Wow. We probably should go to the audience question, right?
Yeah.
One more thing.
All right, yeah.
Just to plug the women, that anti-lynching campaign, Ida B. Wells brought it to his attention. And they would meet and talk right in here about it.
Stay with
Yeah.
She would bunk here because when she didn't have anywhere else to live.
Right.
She became good friends with Helen Pitts. They were good
Just
buddies.
wanted to
Yeah.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Well, we appreciate this part of our dialogue. What we'd like to do now is opening it up for questions for the audience for the next few minutes. I think we'll have a handheld mic that will, there we are. So if you have a question of our esteemed panel, please raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you. You can ask the question and we can roll from there.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to know, when you were making the decision on what subject you might decide to take up, what biography you might do as a wonderful history professor at Yale University, what drove you to come to the decision to do this marvelous biography on Frederick Douglass?
I'm going to let the wonderful professor at Lemoyne College answer that first, because she has her own interesting story.
Okay.
And we became actually collaborators, you should know this,
Okay.
on various aspects of our research. Without Lee, there's a whole lot of letters and other things I wouldn't have had. But you go first on it.
Oh, well, I know you asked him,
How'd
the
you-
Yale
how'd you-
professor.
How'd you get to
Both.
Mr. D?
What drove you? You're not black. You know what I'm
Yes,
saying?
I know.
You're not, you wouldn't be the person that you might think.
You can't be sure about
Yeah,
it.
you would take
Well,
this
no,
on.
Louisiana passed.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, no, it was, I mean, I think I read Douglass in high school, but like a lot of things you read in high school, you just go. And I assigned Douglass for a history class, and it was one of my most profound reading experiences. It was like, I remember sitting there reading it, and it was like, wow. And then when I got my PhD, I was kind of sour on the academic world, and a job came up to work at the Frederick Douglass papers, and I was like, I want that job, and I got it. And I worked on his letters, publishing his letters, for a couple of years, and the whole time I was working on it, I kept just noticing all these women in the background. It was like the first couple of years, like the first years of his correspondence, and I started thinking about, I was watching a lot of VH1 too, behind the music and things, and I started noticing a kind of a correspondence between the people. Like, he didn't just happen. There are all these people behind celebrity. And I got interested in the women, and I started thinking, I would like to write a book about him, about the women that were around him. And it gradually evolved into, I mean, I thought it would just be chapters about each woman. And my friend Babu, who won on Jeopardy, so he's really smart, told me, no, nobody's interested in them. They're interested in Douglass. So you need to make it about Douglass, but using them. And so that it kind of developed from there when I started to see, yeah, what does he look like when you look at the women around him, like the negative space around him being the women. And the more I got into that, the more I realized, first of all, very few other historians, because his work was not out, very few other historians had considered the women seriously, if at all. And that when you started to look at the women, you realized just how incredibly important they were in making Douglass happen as Douglass and keeping him going. And that's kind of how it got going. And then like a lot of those women, I just found him so incredibly compelling. He's a compelling person. And, yeah.
It's interesting.
The short version is, I came of age in the 60s and 70s. I took the first ever African-American history course at Michigan State when I was an undergraduate, taught by Les Rout, who was a Brazilianist, but he was black, and they said, Les, teach black history, and he did. It was great. I think I read Douglass in that course, but I'm not sure. I spent 7 years as a high school teacher in my hometown of Flint, Michigan. I had a poster of Douglass on the wall. I didn't know a lot about him yet. I still have that poster up in my apartment. When I went to graduate school, I wanted to work on abolitionist, anti-slavery, the coming of the Civil War, and particularly black abolitionists, and I landed on Douglass. And I've been studying Douglass on and off in almost everything I've done ever since. I also think I've been drawn especially to his language. This man was, compelling is one word. Genius is overused, but he was a genius with language. You can read Douglass the rest of your life. You can read you can read speeches, essays the rest of your life. You can read the autobiographies several times. You will see new things. He's that kind of writer who can penetrate to the center of a subject. Also, I mean, but the best answer to anything is that he is so damned interesting and important. I also found that it's useful in biography if you like your subject, but you don't utterly overlike them, because you're going to find flaws. Douglass was a thoroughly human being, and he had a lot of flaws, lots of them, and it only made him that much more interesting. I also found that there's just a lot of American history to learn through this guy's life. And that's one of the good reasons to do biography. There's so much history flowing through his story.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity. Given the history of what was happening in Haiti, as well as perhaps Brazil, I was wondering whether or not Mr. Douglass had a Pan-African perspective.
No. I don't want to disappoint anybody, but he really was not a Pan-African thinker. However, he had a deep interest in Haiti. And of course, many of you know he became U.S. Minister to Haiti in 1889 to 91. He was the third African American to go to Haiti as the U.S. Minister or Ambassador. He'd always been fascinated with Haiti, as Americans always have been, sometimes not for very good reasons, as we're experiencing right now. Oh, the poor Haitians. But he never really developed, to be quite frank, a broad or deep interest in Africa. He was interested in Africa, for sure. He was interested in its history, but not in a kind of Pan-African sense. He did not see himself representing, if you will, a Pan-African ideology or mentality of the late 19th century, which other black leaders did. Make no mistake. Henry McNeil Turner, the bishop of the AME Church, and many others did. But that's not Douglass. Douglass is a dyed-in-the-wool, born and raised to him, American, and I don't mean that in any necessarily patriotic sense. He believed it was the birthright of black people, even though most of them had been born in slavery. Nevertheless, it was their birthright to inherit the same creeds as everyone else here and make them their own. He had deep interest. Let's face it, he came of age as an Anglophile. Britain was part of his liberation, going to Britain in 1845 for 18 months, going to Britain again a decade and a half later. Many deep ties with Britain, many deep friendships important friendships and ideological ties with British thinkers and British abolitionists. He's an Anglophile. But he did gain quite an interest in Egypt, and will visit there on his 11-month tour of all over Europe and the Mediterranean in the late 1880s with Helen Pitts, his second wife. And there's that famous photograph of him sitting at the base of one of the pyramids, all way overdressed for the desert, but that's Douglass. He always dressed up for his photographs.
Well, and he climbed the pyramids too, because
Climbed
you could climb the pyramid. He said somebody carved his name at one of the blocks up at the top, and
That might have hastened the heart disease.
well, and, no, and he was on, like, he turned 70 on the voyage as he left, but he said he wanted to determine if the people who built the pyramids were the ancestors of white people or black people, because that was part of the debate of the Victorian anthropology, and he decided it was neither. But again, it was part of the debate as to whether Africa had produced any ancient real civilizations, and they obviously didn't know about Timbuktu or anything else, but that's a whole other story. So I think the lady in the yellow shirt here has had her hand.
On?
Okay.
Yes, Frederick Douglass is very difficult to define because, as I read in your book, that the Haitians actually was there in Baltimore to give him his first skills in boat making, caulking, and things of that nature. So I think he had that kind of strategic relationship with the outside world of the United States, dealing with black people. But my question is defining. The mayor mentioned that we have the founding fathers, and then we have Frederick Douglass as a defining father. And I just wanted to just get a little more sense as to why that particular term is being used as describing Frederick Douglass, and because on the 15th Amendment, as we know, that's citizenship. And I think Frederick Douglass was very concerned about citizenship because Plessy versus Ferguson, one of the reasons why they said, oh yes, black people are property, but because they were not citizens. So it was important to make in the 15th Amendment that they were citizens and then go from there. And I think that is what makes our whole country as pluralistic as it is, in that now anyone born in the United States becomes a citizen. And through immigration laws, then they defined it, but it went further than that. So in terms of defining what defining father is, I just want to get a little further clarification on that particular issue.
Well, the 14th Amendment gave us citizenship rights, 15th the right to vote, but Mayor?
Yeah, it was really founding in the sense of why we became the capital, not the country. How it is that throughout the Revolutionary War, Philadelphia in Pennsylvania was the capital. Then when the first federal Congress met in New York, they voted to have the capital again in Pennsylvania, not in Philadelphia, but that Madison, Jefferson, and Washington wanted to make certain it was not in the abolitionist-leaning state of Pennsylvania. And that's the only reason we say founding fathers. The consolation prize is at the Main Avenue is Pennsylvania. Defining because we became a significant community as a result, in large measure, of the Civil War. And that's why we have Frederick Douglass in that cluster. But when we become, and we will become, the 51st state, he will be a founding father of the Douglass Commonwealth. You can be assured.
By the way, he was a very active, explicit supporter of D.C. statehood.
He was.
In the 1880s, he was very explicit about it. He didn't understand why it wasn't a state back then.
Thank you so much. Really enjoying the discussion. You both had talked about the women that supported Frederick Douglass. I'd like to hear a little bit more about, and I read your book and enjoyed it thoroughly, Anna Murray and Ottilie Assig.
Oh.
Thank you.
How much time you have? Go ahead.
Okay, well, there is a book out there that posits that he had this affair with Ottilie Assig. I don't believe it at all. There's not, the evidence is just not there. That said, I do believe they were really good friends. Frederick Douglass and her were good friends because she brought to him this German intellectual milieu. So she brought to him this kind of intellectual world, that was otherwise not available to him. And she also brought his work to a German-speaking audience. But she was very snobby, and she just kind of would treat visiting Douglass's house. She'd come from, depending on which year, a couple of weeks to a couple of months, especially during an election year when they lived behind the Capitol. And she would just kind of move in like, this is my boarding house now. And she treated Anna like she was a domestic servant. And Anna was far more than that. Anna gave as good as she got, which I really like about her, because, and she didn't have to be catty or mean. She was just like, this is my house. And so Anna, though, but Anna's far more interesting. Anna was one of the people who early on raised Douglass up. And like you said, Douglass might want to move away from people when he was afraid they would figure out where he came. She knew Douglass from beginning to end. She would be the one to keep him. She would, at the end of the day, she knew who he was. And she kept it. In fact, it was a woman, a teacher I just met. She was also a Gold Star mother. And she said, thank you for giving her her due, because I know what it's like when the husband goes away for a long time and then comes back. And you have to stay there, and you've got to take care of everything at home. You've got to get the kids up and fed. You got to get them to school. You got to take care of when a crisis happens in the moment, and you've got to take care of it. They're sick, you got to take care of it. Something happens at school, you got to take care of it. And that's what Anna had to do. And she sewed shoe tops together to help bring in income. She knew how to do the money, so she made it economically solvent. And then if you think about the life she had to lead, which she was looking for when she met Douglass, she was a free black woman. She was making her own money, but she was looking forward to a life married to an enslaved man. While their children would be free, they would always be in danger. She wouldn't be raising primarily them. She'd probably be raising other people's children, working in other people's house. It would be a rough life in a working class household in a city that was primarily enslaved. So she helped him run away, and she went with him. So it was kind of a joint venture, and she left everything else behind herself. And when he named himself Douglass, it was actually they named themselves Douglass. And so she was one of those women who helped lift him up, and including this house, every house they owned, her name was on the deed, and her mark. And yeah,
it wasn't.
Her funeral was held right here. Her body was laid out here. Her funeral was out here, like 300 people. She was initially buried on Grace Cemetery, that is no longer there, until they moved the body over to into Rochester. And she was on, and I figured out what their attraction was. Every time she appears in the records, she's got a gift for language herself. Not in the same way Douglass does. As her daughter put it, she might say it in a way that causes the listener to smile, but she knew how to use language. She knew how to get to the point. She knew how to use a pun. So she knew how to use, and I could just see Douglass in Baltimore as a 20-year-old meeting this woman who could tell him what for, tell him in a sharp way with wit, and like him going, I need to know a little more about this, And so, in their marriage, it took a turn. Like 3 years into their marriage, he gets involved in abolition and takes him on this other path. I think at some early in their life, she thought she was going to be a minister's wife. It was explained to me by a minister's wife what a status that would have been. But she's really a fascinating person. And then he keeps bringing people home, and they're invading their privacy and calling attention to them. And so she's there barring the privacy. But I'm babbling on because, I could just...
No, we just know that you have an Uber to get to the airport.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just, okay, yeah.
Man's giving us a stop.
And he's telling us to stop and read about Anna.
Can I just add quickly about Attilia Singh and Anna and others? The only thing I've ever disagreed with Lee Ford on, ever, is this question. And maybe afterward we can discuss this, but the evidence is hard to pin down precisely. I do think Douglass had a relationship with Attilia Singh. I yield to Lee on the nature of it. It was an extremely messy, complicated situation in the extended family.
Yeah.
She became very good friends with two of his sons, mostly. And she hung around Douglass's life for up to 22 years, this brilliant German woman. Anna, however, remained Anna until the end. She was a strong domestic woman who, yes, remained non-literate, but she did keep the financial books. She did run more than one household. She raised 5 children. The 5th one, who died at age 11, was her namesake, Annie. And then there were 21 grandchildren, all of whom swarmed around this house right here at any given time, and almost half of whom died in either infancy or up to their teenage years. And they held one burial after another from this house for the grandchildren before Anna died. The trajectories of their lives could not have been different. Douglass becomes this world-class thinker, writer, traveler. Anna remained at home. I was told by some women historians once to stop worrying about whether Douglass was a good father at times or abandoning his kids at times, and stop worrying about it. This was the 19th century. This is what most women did. And Anna followed this guy out of slavery with the same bravery he had, because she was crazy in love with him. And he was not only crazy in love with her, but he needed her, badly needed her, until certain parts of his life when maybe he didn't. But when she died here, he came apart. That, I think we know, was probably the second major breakdown in his life. He came apart. And he went off up to Maine, up to Poland Springs, of all places, where we now buy our water bottles, and just hung out there for 5 months or more. And he wrote some amazing letters to his daughter about what this death meant to him, to the family, to the children. So it's a very complicated marriage. There's certain things about it that are kind of modern, and some things that are not modern at all. And it tested his feminism.
Well, the day of the funeral, I'm sorry.
You get the last word.
The day of the funeral, and this story, just up like when I first read it, was the day of the funeral, his daughter, Rosetta, brought her children over, and Frederica, his namesake, writes this in her memoir that's over at Howard. Her and her brothers and sisters and their little children go bouncing down the hill looking for Grandpapa, and they find him down the hill, and he's crying. And they sit by him, and he's just crying. He's saying, "Your grandmama's gone. Your grandmama's gone. You have a grandmama no more." And he says, she said, "I guess he wanted us to remember grandmama." And I'm just like, he's sitting there crying about her. And I just want to cry. But, we never have... this is like the only record we have of him crying. He's that moved to emotion over her loss, and and here's her body laid out, and it's just this really private, tender moment. So.
By the way, all of Douglass's rivals capitals here in D.C., all the next generation of young black leaders who were always fighting with Douglass in the press, they all elbowed each other out of the way to be pallbearers at Anna's funeral.
Yeah.
They all wanted a piece of it.
Respect. And
he chose the 8.
On you.
Yes, many. There's one family this is a question about how many descendants are still living. Many. And the most active family is the matriarch of which is a woman named Nettie Washington Douglass. She is the granddaughter of Booker T. Washington and the great-granddaughter of Frederick Douglass. You ever get a chance to meet Nettie, do it.
Kenneth Morris.
Yeah.
Ken Morris.
Yeah.
Son. Sure.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Blight. Thank you, Dr. Fort. Thank you, Michael. Thank you all. And above all, we want to thank the founding father for the Douglass Commonwealth, Frederick Douglass.
So with that stimulating conversation behind us, we now want to draw on the words of the man himself, none other than Frederick Douglass. And we're going to hear some excerpts from some of Mr. Douglass's most powerful speeches, Mayor.
Yes, and we're very fortunate indeed to have Frederick Douglass with us today in the person of Shawande T'Challa, and who is a native of what will be the Douglass Commonwealth. He was born here. And as we know that, and was pointed out particularly by Dr. Blight, that Frederick Douglass took full advantage of the new technology of photography up here, right here on this porch. And he understood the importance of establishing his own persona and a unique image. And to that end, we'll hear from him an excerpt from his 1862 speech, Age of Pictures, as presented by Frederick Douglass.
This may be termed an age of pictures. The sun, in his course, having turned artist, has flooded the world with pictures, daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, engravings and drawings, good, bad, and indifferent, adorn and disfigure, and as frequently the latter than the former, all our dwellings. No man thinks of publishing a book without sending his face to the world with it. He may be handsome or homely, manly or otherwise, it makes no difference. The face, the inevitable face, must be there to meet the smiles and frowns of his readers. Once in the book, whether the picture is like him or not, he must always, forever after, strive to look like the picture. The photographic faithfulness of our pictures in delineating the human face and form answers all well the stern requirement of Cromwell himself. "Paint me as I am," said the staunch old Puritan. The order reveals perhaps quite as visibly his self-love as his love of truth. The huge wart on his face was probably in the eyes of the great founder of the English Commonwealth of beauty, rather than a deformity. But in any case, we are bound to respect the requirement. No lack of comeliness deters anyone now for sitting for his likeness, for there are none so unprepossessing as not to have an admirer. It is sometimes a difficult task for a stranger to comment upon the family pictures everywhere presented to his admiring eyes. The portrait makes our president. The political gathering begins the work. The picture gallery ends it. A rather awkward-looking friend of mine, having far more wit than beauty and far more philosophy than most men, used to console himself with the idea that he too would be beautiful upon favorable change in public sentiment. Nearly all religious teachers admit that Negroes will be white when they get to heaven. The President of the United States has improved much since his inauguration. A very pleasing feature of our pictorial relations is the very easy terms upon which all may enjoy them. The servant girl can now see a likeness of herself, such as noble ladies and even royalty itself could not purchase 100 years ago. Formerly, the luxury of a likeness was the exclusive privilege of the rich and great. But now, like education and 1,000 other blessings brought to us by the advancing march of light and civilization, such pictures are brought within easy reach of the humblest members of society. It is not, however, of such pictures and embellishment that I am here to speak. The artist and art student can best treat of these. My course lies in another direction. There are certain groups and combinations of facts and features everywhere met within the journey of life, some pleasant and some sad, which possess in large measure the quality of pictures. They illustrate and body forth phases of real life common to all and translate into living forms and colors the outgrowths of the inner life of the soul. Some such pictures as these, if I do not miss my aim, as many other lecturers have done before me, may pass in review this evening. Happily, however, no great skill or special talent is required to describe them. They stand boldly out from the broad canvas of human experience and fringe the horizon of our existence like the many shapes and many colored clouds against the summer sky. They flit by us like the dreams of a childhood. There are, then, pictures of mind as well as of matter. They have an interest for man which accords with their relative values. To describe fitly a mental translation, an operation of the mind, is more than to paint the form of a horse. And yet, there are more good mind painters than good painters of horses.
You got a glimpse of the intellect of the man, someone who was self-taught, born into slavery and was able to put himself in the position to express those words and to say them with the feeling and experience that others in his hearing could relate to. When I think of the 400 years of slavery in America, I often ask myself, how many more Frederick Douglasses are out there? How many more young men and young women pulled themselves through and were able to take advantage of the opportunities in a way that would land them in this space? Throughout all of these decades in our history, certainly his life, Douglass used photography to counter the racist stereotypes of black people. He presented a dignified example, an intelligent example, a respectable example, a free example of African American men and women. So not only did he humanize the visual aspect of being an African American, he humanized our language, our conversations, our experiences in a way that made a difference. And he was able to do it and shape the minds of his audience through photography. He exerted this new technology to increase not just his own visibility, but the visibility of all others like him. So much so that his image became synonymous with the fight for freedom and equality itself. So he used technology strategically, smartly. He did then what we do with social media today in how we tell our stories, how we reach the masses and imprint on them an impression of us, to highlight, for example, social justice issues, to highlight issues that humanize the marginalized and give a voice to those who otherwise would go unheard and unseen. He did all that with photography. Let's hear a little bit more from Mr. Douglass now from his 1888 speech before the International Council of Women right here in Washington, D.C. In this soliloquy, Douglass recalls his role at the Seneca Falls Convention, insisting women rather than men should be the primary spokespersons for the movement.
Mrs. President, ladies and gentlemen, I come to this platform with unusual diffidence. Although I have long been identified with the woman suffrage movement and have often spoken in its favor, I am somewhat at a loss to know what to say on this really great and uncommon occasion, where so much has been said. When I look around on this assembly and see the many able and eloquent women full of the subject, ready to speak, and who only need the opportunity to impress this audience with their views and thrill them with thoughts that breathe and words that burn, I do not feel like taking up more than a very small space of your time and attention, and shall not. I would not, even now, presume to speak, but for the circumstance of my early connection with the cause and of having been called upon to do so by one whose voice in this council we all gladly obey. Men have very little business here as speakers, anyhow. And if they come here at all, they should take back benches and wrap themselves in silence. For this is an international council, not of men, but of women, and women should have all the say in it. This is her day in court. I do not mean to exalt the intellect of woman above man's, but I have heard many men speak on this subject, some of them the most eloquent to be found anywhere in the country. And I believe no man, however gifted with thought and speech, can voice the wrongs and present the demands of women with the skill and effect, with the power and authority of woman herself. The man struck is the man to cry out. Woman knows and feels her wrongs as man cannot know and feel them. And she also knows as well as he can know what measures are needed to redress them. I grant all the claims at this point. She is our own best representative. We can neither speak for her, nor vote for her, nor act for her, nor be responsible for her. And the thing for men to do in the premises is just to get out of her way and give her the fullest opportunity to exercise all the powers inherent in her individual personality and allow her to do it as she herself shall elect to exercise them. Her right to be and to do is as full, complete, and perfect as the right of any man on earth. I say of her, as I say of the colored people, give her fair play and hands off. There was a time when perhaps we men could help a little. It was when this woman's suffrage cause was in its cradle, when it was not big enough to go alone, when it had to be taken in the arms of its mother from Seneca Falls, New York to Rochester, New York for baptism. I then went along with it and offered my services to help it, for then it needed help. Oh, but now it can afford to dispense with me and all of my sex. Then its friends were few. Now its friends are many. Then it was wrapped in obscurity. Now it is lifted in the sight of the whole civilized world, and people of all lands and languages give it their hearty support. Truly, the change is vast and wonderful. Though my eye of faith was tolerably clear when I attended those meetings in Seneca Falls and Rochester, but it was far too dim to see at the end of 40 years a result so imposing as this International Council. And to see yourself, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Miss Anthony, alive and active in its proceedings. Of course, I expected to be alive myself, and I'm not surprised to find myself so. For such is perhaps the presumption and arrogance common to my sex. Nevertheless, I am very glad that you are its president. No manufactured boom or political contrivance, such as makes presidents elsewhere, has made you president of this assembly of women in this capital of the nation. You hold your place by reason of eminent fitness, and I give you joy that your life and labors in the cause of woman are thus crowned with honor and glory. This I say in spite of the warning given us by Miss Anthony's friend against mutual admiration. There may be some well-meaning people in this audience who have never attended a woman's suffrage convention, never heard a woman's suffrage speech, never read a woman's suffrage newspaper. And they may be surprised that those who speak here do not argue the question. It may be kind to tell them that our cause has passed beyond the period of arguing. The demand of the hour is not argument, but assertion. Firm and inflexible assertion. Assertion which has more than the force of an argument. If there is any argument to be made, it must be made by opponents, not by the friends of women's suffrage. Let those who want argument examine the ground upon which they base their claim to the right to vote. They will find that there is not one reason, not one consideration which they can urge in support of man's claim to vote, which does not equally support the right of woman to vote.
So if Frederick Douglass was seeking office now, I think he'd win. Think he would. Boy, that 1888 speech was given right here in Washington, D.C., and it was such an inspiration, and he was, as Dr. Fort points out, a very liberated man. I mean, extraordinary that he should have those remarks then, and we have a few people like Michael, but we don't entirely still have some struggles now. We have some people running for office now who still have those problems. There are many lessons we can learn from Frederick Douglass. But I want to also have us, I think we conclude with this because it's quite controversial in Washington, D.C. His remarks when they had the unveiling in 1876 of the Freedmen's Monument in Lincoln Park in Washington, D.C. And the unveiling of that monument, I mean, money was raised for this monument in the African-American community. I don't know how many people had gotten a sense of what this image would be. But nonetheless, you have Abraham Lincoln sort of patting the shoulder, I think, of an African American man who had been enslaved. So there is controversy about it even today. But nonetheless, at that time, Frederick Douglass made remarks. It was quite a distinguished gathering. There amongst them was President Ulysses S. Grant, as well as members of Congress and members of the United States Supreme Court. So we're transported back in time to that moment when he makes his remarks upon the unveiling of what is now perceived somewhat controversial, but was a major milestone in the history of America.
Friends and fellow citizens, the story of our presence here is soon and easily told. We are here in the District of Columbia, here in the city of Washington, the most luminous point of American territory, a city recently transformed and made beautiful in its body and in its spirit. We are here in the place where the ablest and best men of the country are sent to devise the policy, enact the laws, and shape the destiny of the republic. We are here with the stately pillars and majestic dome of the capital of the nation looking down upon us. We are here with the broad earth freshly adorned with the foliage and flowers of spring for our church, and all races, colors, and conditions of men for our congregation. In a word, we are here to express, as best as we may by appropriate forms and ceremonies, our grateful sense of the vast, high, and preeminent services rendered to ourselves, to our race, to our country, and to the whole world by Abraham Lincoln. The sentiment that brings us here today is one of the noblest that can stir and thrill the human heart. It has crowned and made glorious the high places of all civilized nations with the grandest and most enduring works of art designed to illustrate the characters and perpetuate the memories of great public men. It is the sentiment which from year to year adorns with fragrant and beautiful flowers the graves of our loyal, brave, and patriotic soldiers who fell in defense of the Union and liberty. It is the sentiment of gratitude and appreciation, which often, in the presence of many who hear me, has filled yonder heights of Arlington with the eloquence of eulogy and the sublime enthusiasm of poetry and song. A sentiment which can never die while the Republic lives. Fellow citizens, in what we have said and done today and what we may say and do hereafter, we disclaim everything like arrogance and assumption. We claim for ourselves no superior devotion to the character, history, and memory of the illustrious name whose monument we have here dedicated today. We fully comprehend the relation of Abraham Lincoln both to ourselves and to the white people of the United States. Truth is proper and beautiful at all times and in all places. And it is never more proper and beautiful in any case than when speaking of a great public man whose example is likely to be commended for honor and imitation long after his departure to the solemn shades, the silent continents of eternity. It must be admitted, truth compels me to admit, even here, in the presence of the monument we have erected to his memory, Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model. In his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was a white man. He was preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. He was ready and willing at any time during the first years of his administration to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity in the colored people to promote the welfare of the white people of this country. In all his education and feeling, he was an American of the Americans. He came into the presidential chair upon one principle alone, namely opposition to the extension of slavery. His arguments in furtherance of this policy had their motive and mainspring in his patriotic devotion to the interests of his own race. To protect, defend, and perpetuate slavery in the states where it existed, Abraham Lincoln was not less ready than any other president to draw the sword of the nation. He was ready to execute all the supposed guarantees of the United States Constitution in favor of the slave system anywhere inside the slave states. He was willing to pursue, recapture, and send back the fugitive slave to his master, and to suppress a slave rising for liberty, though his guilty master were already in arms against the government. The race to which we belong were not the special objects of his consideration. Knowing this, I concede to you, my white fellow citizens, a preeminence in this worship at once full and supreme, first, midst, and last. You and yours were the objects of his deepest affection and his most earnest solicitude. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best only his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by forces of circumstances and necessity. To you it especially belongs to sound his praises, to preserve and perpetuate his memory, to multiply his statues, to hang his pictures high upon your walls, and commend his example for you, for to you he was a great and glorious friend and benefactor. Instead of supplanting you at his altar, we would exhort you to build high his monuments. Let them be of the most costly material, of the most cunning workmanship. Let their forms be symmetrical, beautiful, and perfect. Let their bases be upon solid rocks and their summits lean against the unchanging blue overhanging sky. And let them endure forever. But while in the abundance of your wealth and in the fullness of your just and patriotic devotion, you do all this, we entreat you to despise not the humble offering we this day unveil to view. For while Abraham Lincoln saved for you a country, he delivered us from a bondage, according to Jefferson, 1 hour of which was worse than ages of the oppression your fathers rose in rebellion to oppose. When therefore it shall be asked what we have to do with the memory of Abraham Lincoln, or what Abraham Lincoln had to do with us, the answer is ready, full, and complete. Though he loved Caesar less than Rome, though the Union was more to him than our freedom or our future, under his wise and beneficent rule, we saw ourselves gradually lifted from the depths of slavery to the heights of liberty and manhood. Under his wise and beneficent rule, and by measures approved and vigorously pressed by him, we saw that the handwriting of the ages, in the form of prejudice and proscription, was rapidly fading away from the face of our whole country. Under his rule, and in due time, about as soon after all the country could tolerate the strange spectacle, we saw our brave sons and brothers laying off the rags of bondage and being clothed all over in the blue uniforms of the soldiers of the United States. Under his rule, we saw 200,000 of our dark and dusky people responding to the call of Abraham Lincoln, and with muskets on their shoulders and eagles on their buttons, timing their high footsteps to liberty and union under the national flag. Under his rule, we saw the independence of the Black Republic of Haiti, the special object of slaveholding, aversion, and horror, fully recognized, and her minister, a colored gentleman, duly received here in the city of Washington. Under his rule, we saw the internal slave trade, which so long disgraced the nation, abolished, and slavery abolished in the District of Columbia. Under his rule, we saw for the first time the law enforced against the foreign slave trade, and the first slave trader hanged like any other pirate or murderer. Under his rule, assisted by the greatest captain of our age and his inspiration, we saw the Confederate States based upon the idea that our race must be slaves and slaves forever, battered to pieces and scattered to the four winds. Under his rule, and in the fullness of time, we saw Abraham Lincoln, after giving the slaveholders 3 months' grace in which to save their hateful slave system, penning the immortal paper, which, though special in its language, was general in its principles and effect, making slavery forever impossible in the United States. Though we waited long, we saw all of this and more.
Well, you listen to that and you think to yourself, why was he there again? What wasn't this supposed to be a celebration of you know, the memory and the work? And in a very Frederick Douglass way, he did. He gave it the appropriate context by reminding, I think, all of us, and certainly those in his hearing at the time, that the man that was represented in that statute was flawed and difficult and complex, and wound up doing the right thing after all. Penning those words that would set black men and women free. Never more allowing the United States to do that again. And I think for Douglass, it was as much about coming and standing in front of that group, Sharron, to share that, than anything else. And to say, we're not going back. We're not going back. Did I just do something there? But it is true. It is very true in so many ways in that moment. And the bravery of Douglass to stand there and to articulate that, knowing who his audience was and who he was speaking directly to, made it that much more powerful.
I agree, Michael. I mean, it took a lot of chutzpah to say what he said, and a clarity of thought, and a clarity of who he was, a sense of his own purpose and presence. Not frankly, too many of us today would, in an environment where you know it's so very politically unpopular and you're in their institutional environment, would be able to give so clear a speech. But he certainly gave Abraham Lincoln his due, but he was honest about the journey that he made. So and Frederick Douglass is an extraordinary man, and you just really an extraordinary man. So we really appreciate all of you being here. And is Tanya, are you with us? Is Tanya still here? Good. Because I'm sorry. What's that? Oh, yes. And all of this program will be available on social media on September 23rd, starting at 8 p.m. on YouTube. IPPH has a YouTube, channel, and so it will all be available then. As we've all pointed out, Michael's pointed out, it was W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the National Park Service, Sala, and others who've been so wonderful, but a very steady partner and a very important, prestigious partner for us has been the Community Foundation. And we very much appreciate, Tanya, your being here with us today. Yeah, wherever you want.
So wasn't this the perfect way to spend a Saturday afternoon? And aren't we lucky to be sitting on the front lawn of the Frederick Douglass House on such an amazingly beautiful day? Thank you, Mayor Pratt. Thank you, Chairman Steele, for your vision and leadership with the Defining Fathers Legacy Series. And all of us must thank our very own Frederick Douglass for the gifts that keep on giving. It has been a pleasure to experience the life of Frederick Douglass in its fullest. We are so fortunate that the panel discussion led by some of the nation's foremost ardent leaders and scholars on Douglass's life inspired us this afternoon. Along with eminent historians and dramatic reflections, we were taken on an eye-opening journey, revealing the depths of Frederick Douglass's life. From slavery to the women who were so paramount in his life, to how he leveraged photography, persuaded a president and its people, we owe so much to Frederick Douglass. Were it not for him, our country would indeed be very different. Today's symposium further explored how Douglass's life laid the groundwork for subsequent civil rights movements. This certainly made him a lasting symbol of courage and justice. And again, to convene here at this National Park Service historic site of Cedar Hills in Washington, D.C., only enriched the experience. So when you speak of Washington, D.C., I must share that the impact of the Greater Washington Community Foundation, which is the organization I have the honor and pleasure of leading, is immense and serves in parallel. Since 1973, the Greater Washington Community Foundation has unleashed over $1.7 billion in philanthropic investments to support Douglass's dream of creating a more equitable, just, and thriving Washington, D.C. and Greater Washington region. We too play a crucial role in connecting the past with its present, ensuring that history remains a vital and accessible part of community life. Amongst our cultural initiatives, the Foundation also supports programs that commemorate the rich history and diversity of Washington, D.C., along with deliberate investments in efforts to increase economic mobility in support of present-day Washingtonians and residents in the region. As such, it is a pleasure to be here and to celebrate with you and to discover more of Washington, D.C.'s own Frederick Douglass, truly a man for all seasons. Thank you all for your positive energy, for your time, and for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you at more Institute for Politics, Policy, and History events and Greater Washington Community Foundation endeavors. Have a good day. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
Thank you.